One of our viewers, Geffde, requested a personal call-out, and as ever, we are happy to oblige. Geffde's inciting comment boils down to our truth and fiction article videos basically being INSAG-7. So what are we all even doing here, retreading the trodden? Sure, in the immediate aftermath of the 1986 Chernobyl disaster, there were lies in the Soviet report to the Vienna Meeting, and in the following International Atomic Energy Agency INSAG-1 report that same year. INSAG-7, the 1992 update of INSAG-1, quote-unquote, rebalanced the scales of who and what caused the Chernobyl disaster, and that's about all there is to it. We would like to take this opportunity to more critically discuss the INSAG-7 report we generally use as the top source on the topic. It itself is notably flawed and can mislead readers who aren't wary. Geffde doesn't quite pick up on how equivocally written INSAG-7 is. He, she, it, or they did notice that 4 of the 5 truth and fiction article authors are acknowledged as participants in the preparation of the report that serves as Annex 1 of INSAG-7. On the flip side, there is an overlap of 4 names between the deceitful 1986 Soviet report to the Vienna Meeting and the report that serves as Annex 2 of INSAG-7, that came from the Soviet, or perhaps at that time, even Russian, scientific design and engineering establishment. How do these 2 reports that comprise most of INSAG-7 differ? Annex 1 starts at, let's say, page 30, and ends at page 88. That's 59 pages, as we're including page 30. This is by far the longest of the 3 sections of INSAG-7. If we start scrolling through it, first we see an explicated list under the title 1-3, Violations of Safety Standards and Regulations in the Design of Chernobyl Unit 4. This was the shoe being put on the other foot, describing the violations in design rather than in operation. This lasts for roughly 20 pages. Then, after writing on various things, we get to page 70, where the actions of the operators begin to be discussed in detail, centred on the particular lies they had been accused with. This goes on for about 12 pages. On the other hand, Annex 2 of the Soviet or Russian scientific establishment starts on page 103 and ends on page 132. If you scroll through it, you notice that it is disproportionately comprised of different figures, diagrams, tables, graphs, etc. So we go from 59 pages, overwhelmingly of text in Annex 1, to 30 pages of what could pass as an illustration book for highly gifted children in Annex 2. What's the difference? Annex 2 of INSAG-7 discusses neither design violations nor the false allegations against the operators. Why they did this should be fairly obvious. So, we're left with the first about 29 pages that we call the International section of INSAG-7, written by the dispassionate arbiters of truth at the International Atomic Energy Agency to split the difference. Just like many people not inclined to beat about the bush, we jump to concluding statements offering the key takeaways. We begin at the bottom of page 21, where the half-wit term safety culture makes an appearance. As Geffde points out, INSAG appears irrationally proud of coining this term to the point of confusing Geffde as to whether an ORM violation, a reference to the number of control rods left in the core, actually mattered or not. Safety culture is an anodyne term meant to reflect that everyone involved with nuclear power plants, from the most junior workers physically present on site to the highest authorities wherever they are, should have safety at the top of their minds, and their actions should reflect such an attitude. While this is strictly speaking true, we despise this term in the context of Chernobyl with a passion because its banal idiocy serves to obfuscate rather than to clarify. We will elaborate shortly. On page 22, we see a summary assessment. Quote, INSAG judges that factors leading to the accident are to be found in the safety features of the design, the actions of the operators, and the general safety and regulatory framework. While with new information in INSAG-7, the so-called balance of perception, yet another slime ball expression, needed to be shifted. INSAG remained of the view that in many respects, the actions of the operators were unsatisfactory, just as the 1986 Soviet report to the Vienna Meeting summary statements against the operators relied on specific substantiation to take on real form. So does the lack of satisfaction in INSAG-7. But before we get into specifics, let's recognise what this paragraph and the term safety culture are. They are the means of blaming the system. Who and what is the system? Well, everyone and everything. What is the problem with blaming everyone and everything? As irony would have it, we turn for an answer to none other than the infamous Grigory Medvedev, the author of Chernobyl Notebook, or alternatively, The Truth About Chernobyl, who has deceived many people into believing that operators broke rules under the reckless leadership of Deputy Chief Engineer Anatoli Diatlov, and so brought the RBMK reactor to a disastrous state. At the bottom of page 134, albeit in a different context and quoting whoever this guy was, Medvedev captures the insidious self-serving psychology of simply blaming the system. It seemed that all those responsible for the catastrophe wanted one thing: to postpone the moment of full recognition, when all I's would be dotted. They wanted, as was customarily done before Chernobyl, for responsibility and blame to be spread ever so quietly over everyone. You see, all you doofuses who talk about safety culture and how the system was at fault, when you say generic, borderline meaningless stuff like that, you don't dot the I's and cross the T's. To the contrary, you grab your crayon, put one end in your mouth, and with the other end you colour over everything. The people who actually did wrong get to slide under such infantile strokes. The next result for the word blame in Medvedev's book comes in the words of Chernobyl Unit 4 Night Shift Supervisor Alexander Akimov's wife. While he could talk, he kept repeating to his father and mother that he had done everything right. This tortured him to the very end. He also said that he had no complaints to make against the personnel of his shift. They had done their duty. I visited my husband the day before he died. At that point, he could no longer speak, but there was pain in his eyes. I knew he was thinking about that damned night. He was reenacting everything inside himself, over and over again, and he could not see that he was to blame. Page 23 of the International section of INSAG-7 informs us in bold capitals we're about to read conclusions on factors contributory to the accident. At point 5, we hit the deficient safety culture and let's blame everyone mantra that resonates popularly on an idiotic level. Quote, an assessment of the Chernobyl accident in this respect demonstrates that a deficit in safety culture was inherent not only to the stages of operation, but also, and to no lesser extent, to activities at other stages in the lifetime of nuclear power plants, including design, engineering, construction, manufacture, and regulation. At point 6, we finally hit pay dirt on what exactly the INSAG authors hold against the operators beyond empty words. The dipsticks who wrote this stuff refer to pretty much the entire table of alleged grievous operating violations being in fact not violations as merely certain actions. Writing of ill judgment, the authors never seem to consider the meaning of certain actions having been so strangely misinterpreted by nuclear power experts. Instead of pondering what the hell happened, the INSAG creatures write. Yet INSAG remains of the opinion that critical actions of the operators were most ill-judged. The pack of lies found in INSAG-1 is repackaged. Quote, as pointed out in INSAG-1, the human factor has still to be considered as a major element in causing the accident. Finally, something specific is spit out. However, operating rules were violated, and control and safety rods were placed in a configuration that would have compromised the emergency protection of the reactor, even had the rod design not been faulty on the ground of the positive scram effect mentioned earlier. Most reprehensibly, unapproved changes in the test procedure were deliberately made on the spot, although the plant was known to be in a condition very different from that intended for the test. And so, we have two outstanding focal points after all the lies against the operators have been refuted that still render their actions, quote, most ill-judged, and just plain unsatisfactory. The configuration of the reactor control and protection system rods, and, most reprehensibly, the unapproved changes in the test procedure deliberately made on the spot entailing different conditions from what was supposedly intended for the test. Let us start with the most reprehensible part. Discussing the most reprehensible part warranted half of page 19 in the international section of INSAG-7. The laid out argument is as follows. Sure, the power level of 200 megawatts was ultimately allowable, without any comment as to how and why in INSAG-1 it was written multiple times it was not allowable, aside from because Soviet experts had said so. But the INSAG authors yet again put their feet in their mouths with a presentation of so-called facts. According to them, the test procedure was altered because the operators could not achieve the power level of 700 megawatts written on the paper. Somehow this was related to previous operation at half power, even though over the course of the Kiev delay, lasting for 10 hours in the afternoon and evening of the 25th of April 1986, xenon concentration was decreasing rather than increasing. The clear recovery of ORM, or the insertion of control rods into the core in this period, while power remained the same, should serve as foolproof evidence, especially among people who are supposed to be experts, that the reactor was under no extraordinary xenon poisoning pressure due to having been lowered to half power. Quite to the contrary. Yes, the subsequent reduction to the very low levels would have had the opposite effect, but what the INSAG authors do is conflate events that should not have been conflated. We will explain in due time. Then the International Insag authors pull a Geffde and don their Captain Hindsight hats. Geffde's self-described, untechnical hot-take rejoinder cites a proverb. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. Sure, the test could have been performed at 200 megawatts, according to the operating instructions, that not only lacked a prohibition, but called for operation at 200 megawatts, but the smouldering wreckage of Chernobyl Unit 4 showed that it shouldn't have been. The INSAG authors express this brilliant point in more technical terms. They then accuse the operating staff of not stopping to think about not performing the test at 700 megawatts, and apparently thoughtlessly modifying the power level so-called test condition. Then they condescended to the dead and dying operators by remarking on the importance of well-planned procedures when tests are to take place at a nuclear power plant. If there's something on paper like 700 megawatts in the testing program that was the result of well-planning, you have to evaluate any changes contemplated. So what we have here on page 19 of INSAG-7 is the international authors. When it turned out that there was no such thing as 700 megawatt lower power limit of continuous operation as INSAG-1 boldly proclaimed, not stopping and thinking about the actions of the operators, but on the spot modifying their own logic to match their view at that moment of the prevailing portrayal of the operators as thoughtless and guilty. But what other facts indicate is that the operators were quite less thoughtless than INSAG-7 portrays them. Despite condemning the operators, the International Insag authors failed to avail themselves of an important detail. Roughly 30 pages later, Annex 1 of INSAG-7 comments on the general characteristics of the test program. At the bottom of page 51 and top of page 52, there is a very important paragraph whose direction INSAG-7 as a whole fails to explore. This paragraph reveals that the testing program itself did not come from nuclear authorities beyond the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. One of the many accusations against Chernobyl personnel is that they did not get the testing program approved by the Chief Design Engineer, or NICIAT, and the Scientific Manager, or Kurchatov Institute of Atomic Energy. The idea of the rundown came from NICIAT, but not what the International Insag authors imply was the well-planned procedure. One of the two most powerful men in the Soviet nuclear power industry, Minister of the Ministry of Medium Machine Building, under which NICIAT and the Kurchatov Institute fell, Yashin Slavski, had rather different words for the test in a Politburo meeting on July 3rd, 1986. Shasharin, the Deputy Minister of the Ministry of Energy, was singing here like a Bolshoi theatre performer, but he did not say why a completely senseless experiment was conducted at the MPS. Who needed that experiment? And now it looks like the Ministry of Medium Machine Building was making decisions about how to build the reactor on a whim. But we did not make this decision on our own. The RBMK is a durable, good reactor. But what have they done at Chernobyl? Let us ask, who was directing the experiment? A regional engineer? A regional engineer who had no right to do it was directing the experiment. Besides, they were testing a program that nobody needs. Another set of notes of the same meeting is terser. Why did they need this idiotic experiment? Firefighters died because of the incompetence. The reactor is good, durable, but what have they done? A regional engineer, who had no right to do it, attempted the experiment. The incompetent regional engineer, with the initiative to perform the idiotic experiment, handed down by NICIAT that no other RBMK nuclear power plant had performed despite it being on the books, was presumably one of the foremost nuclear engineers of one of the foremost nuclear power plants in the Soviet Union. Deputy Chief Engineer Anatoli Diatlov of Chernobyl. Diatlov, known among his colleagues as an exceptionally competent leader, was ironically indeed a victim of his own success. INSAG-1 informs us Chernobyl Unit 4 was the most successful RBMK unit. Indeed, on page 29, it argues that it was run so well the underlying reason for the disaster was overconfidence born of excellence. The thrust of the test is attributed to electrotechnical rather than nuclear people, but the test program could not and did not emerge without nuclear personnel's involvement. Indeed, the first two names that appear on the testing program of 1985 and 1986 are Chief Engineer of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant Nikolai Fomin and Deputy Chief Engineer Anatoly Diatlov. Diatlov was the one with initiative and regarded as the bigger expert. As the top of page 52 of INSAG-7 informs us, regulations at the time permitted Diatlov and the nuclear power plant to prepare the testing program without high-level approval. So the well-planned testing procedures the International Insag-7 authors accuse the operators of thoughtlessly changing trace to the operators themselves. Therefore, as we have established from external sources, Chernobyl nuclear power plant personnel were the actual authorities on the testing program. What does the incompetent regional engineer, whose name is at the top of the idiotic well-planned testing program, have to say about the power level? In his initial comment on one of our videos, Geffde claimed that not only do our videos not conclude anything different from INSAG-7, but, quote, Comrade Diatlov, in his criticisms, doesn't really seem to hit the mark either. Well, let's try Comrade Diatlov's article titled Why INSAG Has Still Got It Wrong. Like with us, the subtext points out the INSAG-7 report of the IAEA's International Nuclear Safety Advisory Group has become widely accepted as the closest thing we have to a definitive assessment of the causes of the Chernobyl accident. But INSAG-7 gives an inaccurate picture of what happened, says the plant's former deputy chief engineer. Among the statements found in this article, we encounter the following revelation. I set the 700 megawatt level when I drew up the experimental program at Chernobyl, and it was based on incidental considerations. According to Diatlov, what the 700 megawatt power figure was actually doing in the testing program was based on the preceding task, it having been assumed that they would be checking the main safety valves for which power was needed. This power level could be changed due to the allowances of the actual regulations. Diatlov elaborated in his book how it was on pages 19 and 20. On the assumption that the main safety valves would be tested, first the power needed to be higher to prevent damage. Station instructions required a power figure in the rundown testing program, and it had been unclear what would be done ahead of this test. 700 to 1000 megawatts was set as the maximum power, not the minimum. For the rundown testing program, contrary to a myth, quote, power level doesn't have any significance. The rundown test was just as valid at 700 megawatts as it was at 200 megawatts. We have not seen a mention in any of the actual technical sources of a claim that a lower power level invalidated the rundown test. The speed of the turbine was similar, as it is the resistance of the turbine that varies at different power levels. Looking at courtroom testimony, there is some controversy. Chief Engineer Fomin, under whose authority Diatlov led the test, and who was remarkably uninvolved as well as vulnerable, testified under questioning that while he thought reactor power was reduced to 200 megawatts instead of 700 megawatts, because the operators deemed it safer, and we will see exactly what that means later, a specialist physicist by the name of Kriat, in a planning stage, had demanded the test be performed at 700 megawatts, while Diatlov all along had wanted it performed at 200 megawatts. The prosecutor confronts Diatlov with this claim, who counters that he did not have such a conversation with Kriat. For the record, Diatlov's name appears on the testing program. Kriat's does not. Let's have a look at Kriat's testimony, who was head of the Chernobyl Nuclear Physics Laboratory. Kriat has a couple of specific concerns regarding lowering power from 50% to 200 megawatts, preferring 700 megawatts. The first concern was with respect to the operating reactivity margin, or the number of control rods remaining in the core. Here we encounter an irony of the key of delay. On page 117 of Annex 2 of INSAG-7, the graphs for the highly gifted children reveal a remarkable truth. As the power level was held at 50% for about 19 hours due to the key of delay, beginning at 2 in the afternoon of the 25th of April 1986, the change in xenon concentration flipped, and as xenon retreated to a lower equilibrium level corresponding to a power of 50% rather than 100%, the operating reactivity margin recovered, meaning control rods were being inserted rather than extracted from the Chernobyl Unit 4 core. This unforeseen pause was an alleviation of Kriat's concern that the ORM would drop too low with a further reduction in power to 200 megawatts rather than to 700 megawatts. Note that Kriat was asked why the station nuclear safety department did not include provisions about the danger of a low ORM in regulations, instructions, etc., to which Kriat replied that this was probably a miscalculation of all science, and that sooner or later something would have happened. Criat's second concern was that at a low power, the program for monitoring the physical state of the reactor didn't work well. An expert, accusing Diatlov of interpreting the documents, regulations, etc. his own way, prodded Diatlov on why he considered it possible to perform the test at 200 megawatts. Diatlov responded that as head of the tests, he had the right to, quote, slightly change the conditions while remaining within the regulatory limits. 200 megawatts was not misinterpreting actual regulations. Diatlov claimed he knew the distribution of the energy release field. This will become a topic in the second video. So where does this somewhat muddled context leave us? Did the operators thoughtlessly change the power level from 700 megawatts to 200 megawatts simply because they couldn't maintain 700 megawatts as the INSAG authors claim? Why did Fomin mention that operators thought performing the test at a lower power would be, of all things, safer? We now arrive at the next important thing the INSAG authors missed. In fact, each of the 3 INSAG-7 sections somehow missed this, although one of the timelines tips us off to it. And not the Annex 1 timeline, but the Annex 2 timeline. The Annex 1 timeline just records the entries in the operating log that the reactor power was 720 megawatts at 5 minutes past midnight, while apparently unremarkably, 23 minutes later, it was about 500 megawatts, which is when it abruptly dropped to around 30 megawatts. The Annex 2 timeline adds a curious detail. 5 minutes past midnight, thermal reactor power 720 megawatts, steady unit power reduction continues. An RBMK reactor in the process of xenon depoisoning underwent a continuous steady unit power reduction despite being at the lower end of the power range written in the testing program. This would be a curious choice of words if what was happening was an unexpected and uncontrolled power drop below a target figure. If you look at the 28 minutes past midnight entry, then you see language indicative of loss of control, from 500 megawatts to 30 megawatts. But what the hell happened at around 5 minutes past midnight? Chernobyl scapegoat Anatoli Diatlov notes this seemingly tranquil juncture in his other Nuclear Engineering International article, How It Was, an Operator's Perspective. After passing the xenon poisoning maximum, the reactivity margin began to increase. And at 10 minutes past 11, with the reactor at 50% power, it constituted 26 rods. The operator started to reduce power, and by midnight, when there was no change of shift, this is a typo, the night shift started at midnight, the unit parameters were reactor power 760 megawatts, ORM 24 rods, turbine generator number 8 under load, the plant's other turbine generator number 7 having been shut down, all other parameters normal. So when the night shift took over, they inherited ideal conditions for the test. Power level at target, enough control rods in the core to not worry about, and all other parameters normal. How and why did the steady unit power reduction continue? Here we can give the international authors of INSAG-7 somewhat of an excuse. They still do not appear to have the necessary primary documentation, but both Annex 1 and Annex 2 cite operating logs in their timelines, and apparently withhold information from them. This is a 1996 newspaper article written by Chernobyl Station shift supervisor at the time of the disaster Boris Rogozhkin. Rogozhkin cites the operating logs of senior reactor control engineer Leonid Toptonov. The entry at 5 minutes past midnight states that the steady power reduction was continued on the order of the unit shift supervisor, Alexander Akimov. This is supposed to be the COM switch used on the night of the disaster to enable the control rods to drop into the reactor under their own weight. On the opposite side of the certificate of authenticity is an excerpt from an operating log. If we zoom in on the chicken shit written there, we can make out the entries for 5 minutes past midnight and 28 minutes past midnight. At the item corresponding to 5 minutes past midnight, we can certainly make out the abbreviation for Unit Shift Supervisor, and ultimately read into the chicken shit that power was reduced further on his order. Now, why would this be? Okay, the power level in the testing program was not a safety significant figure as claimed in INSAG-1, but why modify the test conditions? Chernobyl is an incident of irony. The test conditions were modified from before the unplanned power drop at 28 minutes past midnight because, of all things, safety considerations. Going back to Diatlov's article, we read the following. As already mentioned, the night shift accepted the reactor at a power of 760 megawatts. At this stage, the plan called for the removal of electrical load from the generator, while leaving the reactor power the same. From a technical point of view, it is not very good to have high reactor power and unloaded turbine, but plant staff have got to accept the situation. However, apparently following a disagreement between the unit shift foreman and the plant foreman, a reduction in reactor power was initiated. From a technical point of view, it is not very good to have high reactor power and an unloaded turbine. Why would the operators have been confronted with such a contradiction? Jumping to Diatlov's book, we can see the operators had multiple tasks left to complete. The operators needed to complete not only the well-known rundown test, but needed to do vibration measurements on an unloaded turbine as well. If the turbine is unloaded, that means the steam produced at 700 megawatts has to be considered. On page 76 of INSAG-7, we see a mention of a separate turbine rundown vibrations measurement program, which was begun at more than 40 minutes prior to its more famous cousin. The completion of this task was why the 2-turbine disconnection reactor trip was disabled, per operating instructions. A low power level rendered the steam produced less of a concern. We can see this concern in Unit 4 Afternoon Shift Supervisor Yuri Tregub's testimony. I tell Akimov, I have a lot of questions about this program. In particular, where to take the excess power. It should be written in the program. When the turbine is cut off from the reactor, the excess thermal power must be put somewhere. We have a special system that, in addition to the turbine, provides steam intake. Diatlov postponed the conversation with me on the program, and I have already realised that this test will not be on my shift. When Diatlov wrote that while the 700 megawatt power level conditions were not good from a technical standpoint for the particular tasks facing the operators on that fateful late April night, they could still get on with it. We imagine that was an implicit reference to using an alternate system of steam intake. But, as we know, a different decision was made to lower the power level instead, and address the steam concern at its source. Frustratingly, who actually made this decision beyond what is written on paper in operating logs is unknown. Tregub claims that Diatlov argued with Akimov and got the better of him. Diatlov claims that there was some sort of miscommunication between Rogozhin and Akimov. Akimov died soon after the disaster. But we've got a whopper from the Soviet Ministry of Energy's All-Union Research Institute for the Operation of Nuclear Power Plants, VNIIAES, the civilian body providing research support for atomic power stations, in the form of a 1986 report. What we're interested in are pages 158 and 159. We've used the recently released ChatGPT-5 for the translation. This is an analysis of an operating decision. The solution was to reduce the power level to 200 megawatts. The initial state was a stabilised reactor power at 700 megawatts, which by itself is quite an eye-opening statement contradicting the International INSAG-7 author's claim that the operators couldn't maintain 700 megawatts, and so had to settle for 200 megawatts. The premise of the problem is that after disconnecting the second turbine, there will be excess steam. A decision has to be made. The document lists 3 alternatives facing the operators. Alternative A, reducing power and thus steam with a consequence of conducting tests according to a corrected or modified testing program. Alternative B, conducting the tests as written in one of the testing programs at 700 megawatts. The consequences are significant pressure surges and difficulties in stabilising the power unit. Alternative C was scrapping the tests, understanding that the power figure in the testing program is invalid, and shutting the reactor down. Drumroll please. What did this report judge to be the correct decision? Choice A was judged to be the correct decision, modifying the test by lowering the power level. In the course of execution, the power was dropped. And then we get into another can of worms. Go watch the How HBO Chernobyl Got It Wrong Mickey Mouse video. We will go into more cans of worms in the next video of this series. But what have we learned from this video? Well, it didn't really matter that Soviet nuclear power experts lied about a bunch of major violations to the point of making their international counterparts their sock puppets. That's apparently water under the bridge for high-level experts. For whatever reason, the operators must continue to be blamed. After a bunch of empty words and a devious term called safety culture are thrown around to muddy the picture and blame the anonymous, impersonal, paradoxical system containing everyone and no one, the international authors of INSAG-7 decided to highlight their main points of contention with the actions of the operators. In this video, we explored the so-called most reprehensible decision to modify the testing program, namely in changing the power level. It turns out that the international authors of INSAG-7 were very ignorant for the circumstances and thought process of the operators, implying a carelessness that they themselves exhibit best. Neither of the 2 Soviet sections of INSAG-7 discussed the steady unit power reduction event at around 5 minutes past midnight, one section merely noting it. Even Annex 1, the section most defensive of the operators, ascribes consequence to the test not having been performed at 700 megawatts, yet somehow it escaped everyone's attention that the power level deviated from the testing program over 20 minutes before an unplanned drop to around 30 megawatts under ideal conditions for the commencement of the test. It is difficult to speculate how everyone could have missed this, especially with evidence freely floating around that the continued steady unit power reduction was not magical or xenon of origin. Perhaps the evidence started freely floating around after INSAG-7 was already published and people had securely moved on from the Chernobyl disaster. Share your thoughts in the comments, and if any protein powders need more social media creatures to hawk their dumb products, our master debating rates are entry level and friendly.